Hi, welcome to U.S. History, but Interesting, the series where we go through American history connecting with the past by Alan Brinkley chapter by chapter and talk about what the textbook says, what it doesn't say, and why you should care about this history right now in the 21st century. Today, we're covering Chapter 7, the Jeffersonian era. Let's get into it. Last time, we left off with the so-called Revolution of 1800, in which the Democratic-Republican Party took control of Congress, and their leader, Thomas Jefferson, was elected president. Now, the party actually had an opportunity to implement policy based on the principles they had established during the Washington and Adams administrations. As a quick review, Republicans essentially believed that the government should be small, the economy should be agricultural, and society should be based around independent family farms rather than big cities. So, how did all of that work in practice? Well, in terms of small government, they actually did pretty well during Jefferson's time as president. They reduced the number of federal government employees, paid off almost half of the national debt, and repealed all of the so-called internal taxes, including Hamilton's excise tax on whiskey. Interestingly, as part of his push to reduce the size and power of the federal government, Jefferson also drastically reduced the size of the military. I say that's interesting because, in general, in modern politics, when people talk about reducing the size of the government, they don't really include the military in that. It just goes to show that philosophies and political parties drift over time, so history doesn't always map directly onto modern politics. One other thing I want to mention is that Jefferson's commitment to small government actually extended beyond taxes and spending. In 1801, a Baptist community in Danbury, Connecticut wrote to the president, expressing their hope that the government would not discriminate against them, since they were a religious minority in their state. Jefferson wrote back, assuring them that he believed that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, and that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only, and not opinions. Jefferson quoted the First Amendment's guarantee that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, which he said would build a wall of separation between church and state. This is important because separation of church and state is one of those phrases that really seems like it should be in the Constitution, but actually isn't. It's just from this letter. However, whether it's in the Constitution or not, this idea that the government should stay out of people's faith, and at the same time people's faith should stay out of the government, has since become a core part of Americans' understanding of what our government should and shouldn't be allowed to do. But it wasn't all small government lollipops and rainbows during this time. In 1803, the Supreme Court made one of the most important decisions in its history in a case called Marbury v. Madison. The particulars of this case aren't super important, but what matters is this. Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that one of the laws involved in the case contradicted the Constitution and was therefore invalid. This decision established a legal principle called judicial review, which says that the Supreme Court has final authority to strike down laws that are unconstitutional, meaning that they contradict the Constitution. Now, if you remember what I said last episode about the Alien and Sedition Acts, you'll remember that during the Adams administration, the country didn't have a definite answer yet for what happens when the government breaks its own rules. Marbury v. Madison gave us that answer. When it came to what was and wasn't legal for the government to do, ultimately, the Supreme Court would decide. This massively increased the power of the Supreme Court. In fact, basically every Supreme Court case that you'll hear about in this class, or that you'll see on the news during your lifetime, is an instance of the court using the power of judicial review that Marbury v. Madison established. But John Marshall wasn't the only person increasing the power of his branch of government at this time. To see what I mean, let's think through something really quickly. Jefferson wanted American society to be built around independent farms. Now that's all well and good, but farms take up a lot of space, especially when you compare them to the dense urban areas that Jefferson wanted to avoid. The thing is, between 1790 and 1810, the country's population had increased almost 85%. That meant that Jefferson was facing something like 3 million new Americans who should eventually be getting their own farms. At that rate, even a large country like the United States would just run out of space eventually. That meant that Democratic Republicans had to be expansionist, at least in the long term. And that brings us to Jefferson's foreign policy. If you look at the map from 1801, there are basically three places that Jefferson could reasonably consider expanding: Canada, Florida, and Louisiana. Jefferson focused on Louisiana. You see, American settlements were already rapidly expanding west of the Appalachians, but travel and trade across the mountains was so cumbersome that it was actually easier for Westerners to just ship their goods all the way down the Mississippi. The catch was that all trade from the Mississippi ultimately had to pass through New Orleans, making control over that city the key to America's westward expansion. Jefferson sent diplomats to France with instructions to purchase New Orleans, and to understand what happened next, we have to talk a little bit about what the French were up to. In the early 1800s, the French ruler Napoleon Bonaparte decided that he wanted to rebuild France's empire in North America. His plans centered on the colony of Saint-Domingue. Now, Saint-Domingue, which is modern-day Haiti, was not large in terms of land area, but it was one of the most valuable colonies in the world because it was the largest producer of sugar on the planet. The problem was that the colony's entire economy and society were based on some of the most brutal slavery in the world. The expectation was that white planters would import enslaved people from Africa, literally work them to death in just a few years, and then replace them with the next shipload of African captives. Around the same time that the French Revolution kicked off, the enslaved population of Saint-Domingue, who outnumbered free people something like 10 to 1, had staged their own revolution. By 1801, they had ended all slavery on the island and were becoming increasingly independent from the French government in Paris. Napoleon sent a large army to reassert French dominance and probably also reinstitute slavery. I'll link to some videos in the description that go into more detail, but the short version is that through a combination of Haitian military action and local diseases like yellow fever, the French army was almost completely destroyed, and Haiti officially declared its independence on January 1st, 1804. As one biographer put it, Napoleon's brief dream of empire in the West crumbled in the swamps and bayous of Haiti. When war with Britain broke out again in 1803, he concluded that his position in America was hopeless and the Louisiana Territory untenable. Instead of selling just New Orleans as Jefferson had originally hoped, Napoleon agreed to sell the entire Louisiana Territory, some 530 million acres, which would essentially double the size of the United States. The American diplomats eagerly accepted this offer, but there was a problem. You see, the Constitution doesn't explicitly say that the president has the power to buy land. Jefferson had spent years while the Federalists were in power insisting that the federal government only had the powers specifically listed in the Constitution. But now that he was president, he developed a newfound appreciation for Hamilton's idea of implied powers, at least long enough to finalize the Louisiana Purchase. As we'll see many times throughout American history, it turns out that the best time to believe in a strict interpretation of the Constitution is when someone else is president. As Jefferson entered his second term as president, the situation in Europe worsened. Britain and France's on-again, off-again struggle for control of the entire world had settled into a bit of a military stalemate. So both sides settled on economic warfare, with Britain blockading French ports and France sending privateers to capture merchant ships heading for Britain. Despite the fact that the United States was neutral in this war, American shipping got caught in the middle. Traveling to essentially any European port ran the risk of one side or the other seizing their cargo. And the British took it a step further. We talked last time about their policy of impressing American sailors, which is a fancy way of saying taking them off of American ships and forcing them to serve in the British Navy. In 1807, this reached a new level when a British ship called the Leopard actually fired on an American naval vessel called the Chesapeake, and took 4 of her sailors back to Britain, where one of them was hanged for desertion. Americans were outraged by this, and some even called for war with Britain, but Jefferson convinced Congress to try economic pressure instead. This took the form of the Embargo Act, which made it illegal for American ships to leave the country for any foreign port. The hope was that suddenly cutting off trade with the United States would hurt the British and French economies enough to force them to change their policies and respect American neutrality. Instead, it mostly just hurt the American economy. Jefferson would later sign a replacement law called the Non-Intercourse Act, which was similarly ineffective. At the end of his second term, Jefferson followed Washington's example and declined to run again. Instead, Republicans nominated former Secretary of State and Constitution nerd James Madison, who won easily and took office in 1809. Madison continued Jefferson's policy of trade restrictions with something called Macon's Bill No. 2. This also failed to resolve the issue and only served to increase tension with Britain. Unfortunately for Madison, this wasn't the only conflict that was brewing at the beginning of his presidency. On the western frontier, white American settlers continued to push westward into land that had once been owned by Native Americans. Land that the United States had taken through a combination of treaties, land sales, conquest, and, in some cases, outright theft. At this time, there was a growing number of Native Americans who felt like they had to do something to stop the tide of white American expansion while they still had the chance. two Shawnee brothers became the main leaders of this movement. The first brother was named Tenskwatawa. You'll often see him called the Prophet because he was a religious leader who stressed the importance of preserving indigenous culture and spirituality from what he saw as corrupting European influences. The second brother was called Tecumseh, and he was more of a military leader. Between the two of them, they put together a sizable confederacy in the Northwest that the United States saw as a growing threat. However, Tecumseh believed that they were not yet ready to fight the United States, so he traveled south in hopes of rallying support from the Native American nations there. He was mostly met with indifference, with a notable exception of a faction within the Muskogee Nation that we'll come back to in just a minute. While Tecumseh was in the South, American General William Henry Harrison seized the opportunity to attack the Confederacy in the Northwest. He won a major victory at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811 that significantly weakened the Prophet's forces. This victory had a potentially unintended consequence, though. Tecumseh had threatened before to ally himself with the British in Canada, and the destruction of his winter supplies in this battle left him with little choice but to do so now. The British were more than happy to supply him with weapons and ammunition. They weren't at war with the United States yet, but if war did come, they would greatly benefit from having allies to keep the United States busy. And these allies came with the benefit that they weren't British, which meant that if they all died fighting the US, the British war leaders probably wouldn't face any particular backlash at home. And if that sounds heartless and underhanded to you, yeah, unfortunately, that's just how geopolitics works. As British support for Tecumseh became more and more obvious, Americans living in the West saw this as an increasingly urgent reason to declare war on Britain, so that they could cut off the supply of weapons to their enemies on the frontier. So in summary, at this point, the arguments for war were, first, the trade argument. Britain was seizing American ships and essentially kidnapping American sailors. Second, the frontier argument. Britain was funding military buildup among people that the US saw as enemies. Third, we just straight up wanted Canada. I mean, it's full of maple syrup and mooses and stuff, and realistically, American expansionists had had their eyes on that land since our first invasion failed back at the beginning of the Revolution. In 1811, a new crop of congressmen took office. Many of them were what's called war hawks, which means that more than anything else, they really wanted to start a war. And in June of 1812, they would do exactly that. The War of 1812 is kind of a weird one. It's often portrayed as this pointless conflict where nothing really ever happened, and at the end, everyone just sort of got tired and went home. But I think that interpretation depends on choosing to focus on the boring parts of the war. So I'm going to do the opposite, gloss over the parts that were ultimately indecisive, and then focus most of my time on the things that actually mattered. So, there were a number of naval battles on the seas and in the Great Lakes. Basically, none of them mattered. The United States invaded Canada, Britain invaded what is now Michigan, and the British took Washington, D.C. long enough to burn down the White House. Ultimately, none of that really mattered either, except that Tecumseh and his troops fought alongside the British, and Tecumseh actually died during an American counteroffensive at the Battle of the Thames. Without their leader, the Native American Confederacy in the Northwest collapsed. Meanwhile, in the South, a civil war broke out within the Muskogee, or Creek Nation, between a traditionalist faction called the Red Sticks and a pro-United States faction. In the summer of 1813, that civil war spilled over into war with the United States. A Red Stick force that had been supplied by the Spanish attacked Fort Mims and captured or killed almost all of its occupants. Andrew Jackson led the American response, fighting a brutal campaign against the Red Sticks, which culminated in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Jackson's decisive victory in that battle led to the Treaty of Fort Jackson, which forced the Muskogee to hand over more than 20 million acres of land in what is now Alabama and southern Georgia. Surprisingly, some of the land Jackson demanded was actually taken from members of the Muskogee Nation that had supported the United States during the war. Jackson showed little concern for whose land he was taking, just so long as he eliminated the border between Muskogee territory and Spanish Florida, which Jackson saw as an invitation for foreign meddling on the American frontier. With the Creek War concluded, Jackson continued west to New Orleans, where he defeated a British invasion in the most celebrated American victory of the war. Ironically, the Battle of New Orleans actually happened after the war had already ended, just before word of that treaty had made it all the way to New Orleans. And that brings us to the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the war between the United States and Britain, and that's kind of it. The two sides didn't exchange any territory, and Britain didn't change its trade policy or agree to stop impressing American sailors. You can see pretty clearly how, if you look at the War of 1812 as a war between the US and Britain over trade restrictions, it does seem pretty meaningless. However, if you consider the results from the perspective of the frontier, a very different picture emerges. At the start of the war, Tecumseh was leading a major confederacy of Native American tribes in the Northwest with the explicit goal of resisting American expansion. In the South, a large faction of the Muskogee were also becoming increasingly militant about their opposition to American expansion. By the end of the war, Tecumseh was dead, his confederacy had fallen apart, and the Red Stick faction of the Muskogee had been completely destroyed. This cleared the way for the United States to continue expanding westward to the Mississippi and beyond. As we'll see in the coming chapters, the specifics of that westward expansion would become one of the dominant issues in American politics for decades to come. Before we get to that, though, we need to talk about how this war affected American politics at the time. You see, Federalists in New England hated the Republican government, and they really hated the war, especially because many of them were merchants who, in normal times, would make most of their money trading with Great Britain. In 1814, they held a meeting in Hartford, Connecticut, where they discussed, but didn't officially endorse, the idea of seceding from the Union. They also proposed a series of constitutional amendments to limit what they saw as Southern dominance over the federal government. Unfortunately for the Federalists, their timing really couldn't have been worse on this. News about the Hartford Convention came out at about the same time as news of the Battle of New Orleans and about the end of the war. In the context of military triumph and a reasonably successful conclusion to the fighting, Federalists looked unpatriotic and out of touch, and to cut a long story short, the entire party basically just died of embarrassment. So that covers most of the flashy war and politics stuff in this chapter. But let's start drilling down into what life was actually like during this time. And as an example, let's look at that land in Alabama that Andrew Jackson took from the Muskogee. Whenever people move to a new place, they have to find an answer to the question, how am I going to support myself here? For many settlers in the Old Southwest, and in fact for the vast majority of Americans nationwide, the answer was still small-scale agriculture. However, because we're talking about Alabama here, there was another major economic activity, which was plantation agriculture. If you had enough money, and the southern planter class did, you could buy huge chunks of land and a bunch of enslaved African Americans and make a ton of money growing cash crops. Now, historically, the major cash crops were tobacco, indigo, and rice, but there was a shift going on around the turn of the century. You see, Britain had recently developed new technologies that allowed them to produce manufactured goods significantly faster than they ever had before. In particular, the early days of the Industrial Revolution focused on producing textiles, which is a fancy way of saying cloth, fabric, yarn, stuff like that. British factories needed massive supplies of cotton to actually make those textiles, so planters in the American South began to shift away from those old cash crops and toward growing cotton. The one problem with this shift was that people, specifically enslaved people, had to go through and remove all of the seeds from the cotton by hand, which was unpleasant, time-consuming work that made it hard to produce cotton at a large scale. However, in 1793, an inventor named Eli Whitney developed a machine called a cotton gin to help separate the seeds from the fibers. With a cotton gin, one or two people could do in just a few hours what had previously taken an entire group all day to do. This removed the main bottleneck in cotton production and allowed planters to massively scale up their operations and in turn massively scale up their profits. These profits drove the westward expansion of cotton agriculture, and with it, the expansion of slavery into states like Alabama and Mississippi. And with that, I'm going to go on a quick tangent to talk about what the textbook doesn't tell you, which in this particular instance is actually something positive. You may recall that the Constitution contains a clause that says the federal government can't outlaw the international slave trade before 1808. Most states had actually already banned importing enslaved people by this time, but South Carolina had reopened the trade for its citizens. To their credit, the federal government actually passed a law banning the importation of enslaved people to any part of the country, effective on the first day that the Constitution allowed, January 1st, 1808. If you remember back when we talked about the Middle Passage, you'll remember that the voyage across the Atlantic was one of the many horrible parts of chattel slavery. Making it illegal for Americans to participate in that trade was a big deal, and it reminds us that the fight against slavery was not just an American struggle, it was an international struggle. So, let's talk a little bit about international anti-slavery. At almost exactly the same time as the United States, Britain also banned the international slave trade. This was actually an even bigger deal than the American law, because at the time, British merchants were still the biggest participants in the trade. Turning back to the Americas, we talked about how the Haitian Revolution ended slavery there, but we should also mention the ways that Haiti impacted how Americans talked and thought about slavery in the 19th century. Throughout this period, Southern planters lived in constant anxiety about the idea that their enslaved laborers could rise up, kill them, and destroy everything that the planters viewed as civilized white society. The Haitian Revolution was basically that nightmare come to life, and right in their own backyard. I mean, for context, if you live in southern Georgia, you're literally closer to Haiti than you are to Boston. And in fact, similar conditions to what caused the Haitian Revolution led to the largest slave uprising in U.S. history on the German coast outside New Orleans in 1811. Crash Course Black American History and Atunche actually both have videos on the topic that are worth watching, and I'll link to them down below. For pro-slavery Americans, Haiti provided a convenient excuse to oppose abolition without directly claiming that slavery itself was moral. The argument went that even if slavery was bad, freeing black people would inevitably lead to a race war like what happened in Haiti. But Haiti also provided convenient arguments for the other side of the debate. One of the major hurdles that anti-slavery activists had to clear was that most Americans, even in the North, believed in the racist idea that black people weren't smart enough or responsible enough to take care of themselves without white supervision. After the Haitian Revolution, abolitionists could counter this by saying, whatever you think black people can't do for themselves, they're literally doing it right now in Haiti. And there's one other relevant thing about Haiti, which is that they actually provided support to Latin American revolutionaries like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín on the condition that they abolish slavery in the countries they were liberating from Spanish rule. Most of Latin America followed through on this promise. Then, in 1833, Britain gradually freed all of the people who were enslaved in their colonies in the Caribbean and Canada. By the middle of the century, the last major bastions of slavery in the Western Hemisphere were Brazil, Spanish Cuba, and the United States. And that actually brings us back to Alabama, because I mentioned that slavery was expanding during the early 1800s, but the international slave trade was banned. So, where did all the enslaved people who were building plantations in Alabama come from? Well, the answer is mostly the Upper South. You see, Congress had made it illegal to buy enslaved people from Africa, but it was still perfectly legal to buy enslaved people from Virginia. Like the international slave trade, this domestic slave trade also had a tendency to sell individuals rather than families, meaning that it commonly separated parents from their children, husbands from their wives, and people of all ages from their siblings, shipping them somewhere hundreds of miles away without any real hope of ever seeing each other again. This reminds us that while ending the international slave trade was a good and important step towards ending the horrors of slavery, it was only the first step. With that, let's turn our focus to the North for a little bit. The North was still overwhelmingly rural and agricultural during this time, but the first seeds of industrialization were being planted. You see, the British actively tried to protect the secrets of their new industrial technology by preventing people who understood it from leaving the country. But they couldn't keep the door shut forever. In 1789, a man named Samuel Slater came from England to America, and by the early 1790s, he and his business partner had built the first modern American factory in Rhode Island. Although American industry was still in its infancy at this time, it got a bit of a boost during the embargo and war period because Americans didn't have the option to buy British manufactured goods, so they had to turn to the American factories instead. Also, over time, the growing northern textile industry would have the advantage that they didn't have to import cotton like their European competitors. They could just buy it directly from the South. But there was also a major barrier to the growth of early American industry, which is that in order to make money off of a factory, you have to have a way to actually get your products to the people who want to buy them. The North was home to the two largest cities in the country, New York and Philadelphia, but even these were pretty small in the grand scheme of things. In 1800, only 3% of the non-indigenous population lived in cities of more than 8,000 people. Everyone else was spread out across the countryside. Before northern industry could connect with consumers within the United States, the country would have to build up the transportation infrastructure needed to move all of the goods around. And there were, in fact, several big developments on that front during this time. The American engineer Robert Fulton studied British steam engines and figured out how to use one to power a ship. In 1807, Fulton's steamboat, the Clermont, began carrying passengers from New York up the Hudson River to Albany. By 1811, steamboats started running on the Mississippi as well. These new ships made it significantly faster to move people and goods around the country, and the technology would improve substantially over time. Meanwhile, on land, Americans were starting to build better roads as well. The catch was that these roads were privately funded, which means two things. First, you had to pay to use the roads. That's how the companies that built them made money. Secondly, because companies were trying to make money, they only built roads that went relatively short distances between large population centers where they could guarantee enough traffic to make a profit off of the tolls. The farther you lived from the big city, the less these roads directly benefited you. Still, improved transportation, trade, and a shared interest in the national government during this period increased interactions between different regions and spurred the development of a shared American culture. For example, Noah Webster published a dictionary and grammar textbook for children that were designed to codify American spelling and language as something separate from British English, but uniform across the different states of the Union. Around this time, American literature was also starting to develop. Probably the most famous writer your book mentions is Washington Irving, who wrote Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. There was another guy named Charles Brockden Brown who wrote some of the earliest American novels. I mention him because your textbook says, quote, his obsession with originality led him to produce a body of work characterized by a fascination with horror and deviant behavior. Which I just think is funny. I mean, it sounds like the sort of thing you'd hear from your neighbors who hand out travel-sized tubes of toothpaste on Halloween and then wonder why their house got egged for the 9th year in a row. We should also talk about Mercy Otis Warren. I mentioned her last chapter because she wrote an essay opposing ratification of the Constitution, but she's back in the news this chapter for writing a history of the American Revolution. Which is actually kind of interesting if you think about it. You know, for us, the Revolution was 2 chapters ago, and for many Americans, they had personally lived through it. But by about 1800, a new generation of Americans was reaching adulthood that had been born after the Revolution ended. Suddenly, the American Revolution wasn't just a thing that happened a couple of years ago, it was history. So, how did Americans tell their own history during this period? Well, a lot of it was answering questions like where the country came from and how things got to be the way they are, but there was also something else going on. At some level, these were basically people who had done a thing, writing books to tell their grandchildren how great that thing was. As an example of what I'm talking about, you know that story about George Washington chopping down his dad's cherry tree? Well, that story was totally made up. Some guy in 1800 was writing a biography of Washington and just decided it would make him sound cool and help him sell more copies. The point is that the generation that had won the revolution was trying to find ways to teach their children the principles behind the revolution. One way this manifested was an idea called Republican motherhood. Republican motherhood says, a woman's most important job is raising her children. And if she's going to raise those children to be virtuous citizens of the Republic, she herself has to be educated enough to understand what Republican virtue looks like. Now, this wasn't really feminism yet, because it doesn't challenge the idea that women are supposed to do some things and not others just based on the fact that they're women. It actually leans into those gender roles, and as a result, it stops short of supporting any sort of higher education for women. I mean, you don't necessarily need a law school degree to raise your kids. Still, it did get some women better access to education, which is a step in the right direction one way or the other. For now, though, let's talk about what education was like for boys and men. Or at least, white boys and men. We'll cover education for black children after this. You see, the Republican Party wanted white men to receive an education because they thought an informed electorate was healthy for American democracy. But being the party of small government, they had no intention of paying for it. As a result, most schooling and basically all higher education was privately run and charged tuition, meaning that boys and men could mostly only hope to receive an education if their parents could afford it. Higher education was so rare that even professions that we associate with extra schooling today, like lawyers and doctors, generally just learned by doing, sometimes serving as an apprentice to someone who was already established in the field. Basically, the only time you absolutely needed higher education was if you wanted to become a member of the clergy. Finally, let's talk about education for African Americans. For the enslaved, there were essentially no opportunities. In fact, enslaved people were legally forbidden to learn how to read and write. For free black children, the situation was only marginally better. The schools I mentioned earlier basically all banned black kids from attending, but there were some instances where free black communities built and ran schools for their own children, sometimes with funding from local white abolitionists. For example, a black woman named Eleanor Harris started a free school for black boys and girls in 1793, which received some financial assistance from the Pennsylvania Society for the Abolition of Slavery. In terms of higher education, there were basically no opportunities for free black people. However, in spite of the lack of opportunity, we did see a rise in the number of black preachers during this time. And that actually brings us to our last major topic of the day, religion. The American Revolution had brought with it a bunch of Enlightenment ideas, and some of those ideas involved a certain degree of religious skepticism. For example, several of the founding fathers, like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, supported a philosophy called deism, which essentially says that, sure, God created the universe, but he doesn't, perform miracles and answer prayers and stuff like that. He just sits there with a cold beverage and a bowl full of flamin' hot Cheetos and watches to see what happens. Another example is Unitarianism, which challenged some fundamental parts of American Christianity by saying that Jesus was divinely inspired, but not actually divine himself. By the 1790s, many Christian leaders decided to push back on these skeptical beliefs, leading to a revival movement within various Protestant denominations called the Second Great Awakening. During this time, evangelical Protestantism became wildly successful by preaching ideas of active involvement in religion and the importance of forming a more direct personal relationship with God. They also got a tremendous amount of women involved in the movement, although the leadership was still almost exclusively male. It's worth taking a second here to compare this to the idea of Republican motherhood that we talked about earlier. Although these two ideas weren't philosophically related, both encouraged women to take an active role in the moral improvement of society, whether through Christian evangelism or through education. We'll see some of the results of that in the coming chapters. Now, the Second Great Awakening was particularly successful in parts of the country that didn't have firmly established church infrastructure at this time. For example, in the West, Americans were essentially building a society from scratch, and there was room for new religious leaders to swoop in and serve the community. Methodists in particular took advantage of these openings by having preachers ride a circuit, which meant that they traveled throughout the region, forming connections and gathering followers in far-flung communities that couldn't have possibly been served by one single stationary church. At the same time, Presbyterians pioneered what are called camp meetings, where a bunch of people and preachers would all travel to one place, often on the frontier, camp there, and spend several days praying and worshiping together. But the West wasn't the only region where there was an opening for new religious organizations. Back in Chapter 5, we talked about how the South was dominated by the Church of England during the colonial period, but they basically cut ties with them during the Revolution. Now, evangelical Protestant denominations, especially the Baptists, moved in to fill the religious power vacuum in the region. And what's interesting is that in the South, the religious revivalism wasn't limited to white communities. Southern planters eventually allowed preachers to spread their religion to enslaved communities on the condition that the preachers adopt positions that were either neutral or positive toward the institution of slavery. At the same time, for some free black men, the Second Great Awakening opened new opportunities for them to earn positions of leadership and status as preachers. For example, Richard Allen actually created a separate African American denomination called the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia in 1816. Black churches like this would become some of the central political institutions for African American communities going forward. And finally, we should briefly mention that Christianity also spread to Native American communities during this time, particularly in the Southeast. Many members of tribes like the Cherokee and the Muskogee started converting to Christianity. And to bring this episode full circle, you may remember that the Creek War started as a civil war over the influence of white culture in Muskogee society. The spread of Christianity at the expense of the Muskogee's traditional spirituality was one of those concerns. So finally, let's talk about why this matters for us in the 21st century. America's history with Christianity goes back at least as far as the Pilgrims, but this chapter saw evangelical Christianity in particular become a major force in American life, which it still is to this day. That's what I want to talk about. If you look at evangelical Christianity in the news in 2022, it's easy to see it as this deeply, inherently conservative force, both politically and socially. But if you look at what we talked about today, that wasn't always the case historically. For example, when the Danbury Baptists wrote to Thomas Jefferson, they didn't demand that he force everyone to be Baptist. What they said was, look, we know that not everyone believes the same thing we do. All we want is for the government to let everybody worship how they want, just so long as they're not hurting anyone. And that was a very liberal position at the time. As a second example, I mentioned that Southern planters wanted to make sure that anyone who preached to their enslaved workers was either ignoring the issue of slavery or arguing in favor of it. The reason they had to do that was that an increasingly large percentage of Northern Christians were taking anti-slavery stances, and over time, evangelical Christians became some of the key leaders of the movement to abolish slavery, which was arguably the most progressive social movement in U.S. history. And the list goes on. I mean, it's no accident that the most famous civil rights activist in American history, Martin Luther King Jr., was a Black Baptist minister. But look, I'm not saying that Christianity is always a progressive force. It's clearly not. For all of the examples that I just gave, there were conservative Christians at the time pushing back in the opposite direction. My point is that before we look at modern Christianity and label it as permanently conservative, we should know that it wasn't always like that. It really doesn't have to be like that. As an example, right now in 2022, the United Methodist Church is going through a split over issues of LGBT clergy and same-sex marriage. We can't say exactly what will come of that in the long term, but it seems pretty clear that millions of Americans will soon find themselves in a denomination that's willing to conduct same-sex weddings and ordain queer clergy. And that matters because one of the issues that LGBT people face is called religious trauma. It's the feeling of being a child and being told that parts of yourself that you have no control over are fundamentally wrong and disgusting to God. And that sort of thing sticks with you for a long time, maybe forever. But after this, the next generation of queer Methodists hopefully won't grow up with that experience. And the next generation of straight Methodists will hopefully grow up without seeing that happen to their friends and family and assuming that that's just the way it has to be. Ultimately, the point is that being liberal doesn't make you a fake Christian. It never has. People make up their own minds about religion and politics, and sometimes those decisions don't fit the current stereotypes. That's not new. It's just how society moves forward. So that's it for this episode. Thanks for watching. If you found it helpful or informative, go ahead and like the video, leave a comment, or subscribe so you catch future episodes. Otherwise, we'll see you next time for Chapter 8, Varieties of American Nationalism, in which James Monroe ushers in the era of good feelings and everything is perfect and wonderful until the end of time. Or until about 1824. Whichever comes first.